Welcome friends to EPG Pathshala. Our today's topic is open source databases, and in today's session we will see the following. What are open source databases? Why open source databases have become so much popular? Open source versus commercial or proprietary databases. List of open source databases. In open source, there is a category of SQL and NoSQL. So, SQL versus NoSQL databases, and then we will see into detail the SQL databases and the NoSQL databases. Now, before we actually start with the open source databases, let us first of all understand the word open source. You might have already studied this in the earlier modules of open sources, but before, like the last era of databases saw a lot of revolution. The data models were challenged, RDBMS model was challenged, lot of new models came in, and there were lot of changes into database related category. People saw a huge difference into the proprietary databases and the commercial databases, but during the period of 50s to 60s, all the development was usually done by either academics or the corporate researchers, and they shared the code or they shared the softwares which they developed under the principles of understanding, under the principles of common sharing, etc. At that time, the softwares were given with the source code, because a lot of modifications was required even after delivering the software. So, each and every individual changed the software as per their need. But a time came when people stopped sharing, people stopped developing each other's modules. In around 1950s or around 60s, that is after this researchers had gained development, AT&T gave a free software to the researchers and government at no cost. But initially there was reluctance to accept the free software. Free softwares were declined, though in today's market or in today's era, who would not like something which is offered free, unless and until you know there is a reliability. But there was initial reluctance, because people were not aware about its pros and cons, why everybody had a thought, why would somebody give anything for free. So, at that time AT&T had given this software to government, to research scholars at no cost model. A2 was the first software which was released as open source model. It was developed by UNIVAC, but this process came in around 1970s or so, and in after a decade, that is in around 1983, Richard Stallman, as we all know him as a father of open source software, came with his first version of open source software. And after another 10 years, Linus Torvalds, as we all know, in 1991 came with Linux, and the rest is history. All of us know how the markets changed after open source softwares came, how people started accepting open source, how web came into existence, and n number of things. So, today we will understand the open source databases, which are the open source databases, how are they competing with the proprietary databases, and why they are gaining popularity. So, let us start with the open source databases. A database management system, that is a computer software which interacts with user, other applications and other databases. It is a software that handles data management, basically storage, retrieval, updation of data. Open source refers to the software that allows the user to use, modify and distribute the software. The source code is made available, and this type of softwares are registered under open source licensing like GNU, BSD, etc. One thing to note here is, when we say that open source softwares are registered under GNU licensing or BSD licensing, etc. GNU was the project started by Richard Stallman when they released this open source software product. at that time this licensing was given the name as GNU licensing. If you people have observed or if you are aware, there is a term called copyleft licensing. We all have heard about copyright. Copyright says you do not have rights to distribute, but copyleft licensing says that the person whosoever accepts the agreement or accepts the term has the right to distribute the code, to reuse the code, so on and so forth. Very few of us are aware that GNU, or rather than named as GPL licensing, actually comes under the category of copyleft licensing. So, you are agreeing to the terms, that how under which terms you are distributing the code, and then you are allowed to distribute the code. But hardly any of us bothers to read the licensing agreement, or we just click on I agree, I accept, and we move ahead and we download the open source software. So, my dear students, I would always advise you that at least read or understand the open source software which you are using and how you are allowed to redistribute the code and what level of modifications are you allowed to do. So, now let us move on with the requirement or why open source databases. The first thing which is coming here is the no cost label makes them more popular and more acceptable. They are now in the market since more than 2 decades, and the databases which are registered under the open source models are the open source databases. Many of the open source databases are simpler to use than their enterprise counterparts. Now, here when we are saying that many of the databases are simpler to use. So, here now we come to why open source databases. So, the databases which are registered under the open source models are the open source databases. The most important thing, the no cost label makes them more popular and acceptable. They exist since more than 2 decades, and the majority of the databases, that is MySQL, Postgre, Firebird, are simpler to use than their enterprise counterparts. But here, why do we say that they are simpler to use? How come they are simpler to use than their enterprise counterparts? The enterprise editions require the expert knowledge, and the open sources are making use of more and more APIs, giving more and more GUIs to the users in order to make the open source models as easy as possible. But eventually what is happening is anybody and everybody, even with a little database knowledge, is able to use the open source models. Though it has the advantages, but at the same time I feel there are limitations too, because without having proper database knowledge or proper expert knowledge, you are using the open source model, maybe the requirements are not clear to you. So, when we say that there are competition into proprietary and open source, so first of all let us have a look at the differences in open source versus commercial. So, of course, as we said earlier, open sources are simple to implement. In commercial, expert knowledge is required. Open source is available under free licensing, commercial is available at a huge licensing cost. Open source, you need to rely on community support. Commercial, it is dedicated support is provided by the vendor. Open source have less features compared to commercial. Commercial or proprietary are always a feature rich databases. Open sources hardly support advanced features, whereas proprietary database have support for information replication, backup, retrieval of data, etc. The reliability of open source softwares or the databases is completely based on the community support, whereas here in proprietary the vendor takes complete responsibility of reliability and stability. Open source, because many people in the community can give feedback on the bugs or on the issues or add new items, it eliminates a single point failure, whereas in proprietary you have the entity to hold responsible for any kind of bugs. In open source, the communities can add new features, but in commercial you are supposed to wait for the next release. So, here we have seen that there are various differences or various comparisons into open source versus commercial, but still that we know that since last few years open source databases have been gaining popularity. So, first of all, let us have a look at the list of open source databases, and then we go into detail of how these databases are working. So, the list of open source databases: MySQL, MariaDB being the fork of MySQL, Sqlite, Postgre, MS SQL, that is Microsoft SQL Server, MongoDB, Bigtable, Cassandra, HBase and CouchDB. Here you might wonder that why have I written Microsoft SQL? We will come to it when we go into detail. But if you observe the list, there are some databases which are belonging to SQL category, and there are some databases that belong to NoSQL category. You might have already heard that the last 5 to 8 years have seen a category of SQL databases, a category of NoSQL databases. When initially we talked of SQL based databases, RDBMS model was the de facto standard for all. All the databases had to be ACID compliant. But then came a trend where people started again going back to the file oriented models. Document model came into existence, collections came into existence, and all those databases come under the NoSQL category. So, here we will first of all divide our open source databases into the category of SQL databases and NoSQL databases. So, first we have a look at all the SQL databases, and then we move on to NoSQL databases. So, in the SQL category, the first database being Sqlite, let us move on to understand what is actually Sqlite. So, before going to Sqlite, a quick comparison of SQL versus NoSQL. In SQL, the databases are primarily called as RDBMS. NoSQL, they are non-relational or they are the distributed databases. SQL databases have predefined schema. NoSQL databases have dynamic schema, the column length and etc. are not fixed. In SQL, data is displayed in form of tables, that is they follow table oriented data model. In NoSQL, the data is either in form of documents or key value pairs or collections. SQLs are made to handle complex queries. NoSQLs are not suited for complex queries. SQL databases are vertically scalable, NoSQL databases are horizontally scalable. The famous examples of SQL are MySQL, Oracle, Postgre, etc. And the examples of NoSQL are MongoDB, Cassandra, HBase, CouchDB, Bigtable, etc. Now, here when we look at the comparison of SQL and NoSQL, we see that though I have written Oracle as in the comparison in the example, it is a reason, there is a reason behind that because the model which Oracle started following had become a standard for all of us using the database. Initially, when it started with DB2, different databases came into existence, Oracle initial versions, and then improving and reaching the highest level of scalability, security, integration. All that is at its core lies the RDBMS model. And that is why all the other databases which came even as open source, somewhere or the other followed that model. So, when we are talking about a new model, say document oriented model, of course, there is a question that are they giving the reliability, the scalability, the security of the RDBMS model or not. We would see the comparisons into detail. At the end, you yourself would be able to conclude that which database you want to go with as per your requirements. No conclusion would be required from my side. So, starting with the first SQL database, that is Sqlite. Sqlite is not a client server database engine, but it is embedded into the end program. It is the most widely deployed database engine. It does not have a different server process and it reads and writes directly to ordinary disk file. Now, here what actually I want to convey, as soon as the smartphones took on the market, as soon as web applications took on the market, a lighter database was required which will not take a lot of space into your application, whether the application is a desktop based, laptop based, smartphone based, whatever. So, it was only possible if I distribute it, and that is why Sqlite is said to be serverless. It does not require any separate system to be hosted onto and then to be accessed onto, which is a traditional client server model for any of the database. So, that was the first thing, new innovation which they had done with reference to making the database lighter. But that does not mean that it is not following ACID transactions. I hope you are aware of about ACID. We will be constantly discussing or using the term ACID: atomicity, consistency, isolation and durability. Anybody who has learnt the database has learnt ACID first. So, that does not mean that if I am saying that it is serverless, it is not ACID compliant. It is fully ACID compliant. So, let us have features of Sqlite. So, first, as we said already, it is serverless. It has a large collection of APIs. It is written in NCC. It is a cross-platform DBMS. No special configuration is required. As I said already, we are not deploying a machine, so no special configuration is required. The length of columns is not fixed and it is included by default as part of Android software stack. Now, here when we are saying that the length of columns is not fixed, what am I trying to include over here? The columns are dynamic, the columns are dependent on the user requirement, and because the length of columns is not fixed, it follows a completely dynamic model. And by default, this Sqlite is included with Android development stack, because usually the mobile based applications, the smartphones are making use of Sqlite as the database, and that is the reason that it is given by default or included in the Android stack as a database version. There are various improvements done for Sqlite. More and more features are being added. The efforts are made to make Sqlite as lighter as possible. So, that was the first database, web based or smartphone based database which we saw. The second database which we will talk about is Postgre. Postgre you all must have heard about. Postgre has been into market since more than 2 decades, I believe, and Postgre is one of the most popular open source databases which is used by so many researchers, students, commercial vendors, etc. So, let us understand what is Postgre all about. First of all, Postgre is an ORDBMS used to store data securely and make data retrieval easy. But around 1977 or 85, a project called Ingress was developed. It was a proof for a concept of relational database, but they had a focus on object orientation and they developed a query language called QUEL. But they did not use the code of Ingress. They rewrote the entire code for Postgre, and initially it was commercialized as Illustra, but then later on IBM publicized it as Informix. One of the team leader at Berkeley, the research which was going on in Berkeley for Postgre, left Berkeley to commercialize Ingress. He wanted to have a proprietary version of Ingress, but after some 3 or 4 years, he returned to Berkeley in 85 and started Post Ingress project. The students at Berkeley in 1995 replaced the query language of PostgreSQL with SQL and released at as Postgre 95. So, when we say that Postgre saw dedicated 10 years, 15 years of development, a lot of code was rewritten, a lot of versions came, a lot of versions were released and then were taken back. But initially when it was released as Ingress, there were developers who had written the program. Again it started with the code in C and then it was to be distributed. But at that time the team leader who was into that development felt that I can have a new proprietary version of Ingress, and with a plan to popularize it or to release it as a proprietary version, he left Berkeley. But somehow things did not click and he returned eventually after 3 years to Berkeley and started working on post Ingress project. And then after maybe let us say 15 years of development, the version called Postgre 95 was launched. During its release, there was no SQL support. They had their own version of OQL, the language called query language for Postgre. So, the students into that Berkeley, the research scholars into that Berkeley came with the support for SQL, and they made the SQL and they integrated SQL and Postgre together and re-released Postgre as the name of Postgre 95. So, the features which it initially had, though many features are added now on, but Postgre is fully ACID compliant and has support for updatable and materialized view and objects. It has support for lot of SQL features like triggers, procedures, functions and foreign keys. It has support for complex SQL queries and multi-version concurrency control. What do I mean by Mvcc? Each transaction gets a snapshot of the database collection, allowing changes to be made without being visible to other transactions. That is, the transaction feels the isolated feeling. Various extensions are available for download to add additional functionality to Postgre. Here, the table can be set to inherit characteristics from parent table, and it can run on almost all the operating systems like Linux, Unix, Windows, etc. Now, when we say that, here we are saying that it has support of all SQL features. Why are we supposed to mention this, that it has support for all SQL features? Initially we said that it did not use the language SQL, it had another query language, but still it had managed to integrate the features of triggers, stored procedures, and that language which was used by Postgre was named as PQL, the programming for the query language. So, it had written various versions, different blocks we should say, now we term it as APIs for managing or integrating all these things. Even when today when the open source databases are released, they are released with the bare minimum features. Here when we say that it had support of foreign key, why is it required to mention that it has support of foreign key? Because many of the open source databases which are releasing do not give referential integrity supports, do not give relationship supports, are launched with the bare minimum requirement of a database, which is storage and easy and fast retrieval of data. Postgre was very famous at that time, but after end of 90s and starting of 2000, Mysql took away the market from Postgre for a simple reason being that the developers had to write a lot of code, had to write queries differently into Postgre. Even today, but Postgre remains the second most popular language or the second most popular open source database to be downloaded or to be used by the commercial vendors or by the students. So, here in this category we come to the next open source database, which is Firebird. Firebird is an open source SQL relational database management system that runs on Linux, Windows, Mac and Unix. The technology which Firebird uses has been in use since last 20 years, but which makes it a mature and stable product. But when you say that the technology is in the market for last 20 years, of course, Firebird was not in the market for last 20 years. Firebird came in around, the first release was in the early 2000 era, wherein initially the project which was known as Ingress was re-released or redeveloped as the Firebird. Now, when Ingress was re-released, a lot of code was rewritten and Ingress was not used for that particular release. And if you people are aware, when Firebird had already released, immediately after a year or two, Mozilla had come up with the name that it is going to release its browser by the name of Firebird. And they had some licensing issues, some proprietary agreements, and then later on Mozilla decided to change its name to Firefox, and then Firebird was allowed to preserve its name. So, there was also a history again into the naming or the launching of Firebird technology. What are the different features which Firebird has? So, features of Firebird, again it is fully ACID compliant, it has a multi-generational architecture, it has a great community support. So, let us move to features of Firebird. It has fully ACID compliant transactions, it has a multi-generation architecture, it has good and vast community support, it has full support for store procedures and triggers, and we say here it is a very small footprint. Why very small footprint? That it does not occupy a lot of space on your system, or it does not bulk your processor. It has a great API support, no major configuration changes are required, and on Windows Firebird can be run as a service or in the application mode. Now, here when we are saying that it has a very small footprint being it will not bulk your system, it will not occupy a lot of space to be incorporated into your system. Second, when we are saying a huge API support, there is an API called Trace API which helps you to actually monitor what is going on in your system. So, there are such small changes or small inclusions which make Firebird special. Firebird also has a great name now into the market. There are users who want to use Firebird apart from MySQL or Postgres. Firebird is being used by some of the major. Firebird is a fork of Interbase which was released in 2000 and came up with a newer version. Okay. Now, the next we come, here is your GUI of Firebird, has a very similar architecture like MySQL, where you get editor, you get the schema, and the results are displayed below. So, let us now come to Microsoft's SQL Server Express. Microsoft and open source, that is what the feeling you get usually. Microsoft has all the proprietary databases. Why would Microsoft come with an open source? Because of the changing needs of market, because of the changing requirements of user, even Microsoft is compelled to have a open source version in database. We have used many databases of Microsoft in form of Access, in form of Microsoft SQL Server, all are proprietary. But in the recent past, in around 2016, Microsoft had made an announcement that it will release a version for Linux, and then Microsoft came with a community edition or a GPL licensing version for named as Microsoft SQL Express Standard Edition. There was a release which is available on Microsoft website for demo, Microsoft SQL Server for Linux. So, let us understand free Microsoft SQL Server Express. As you can see the GUI, a free version of Microsoft popular SQL Server is targeted at smaller scale applications. many of the core functionality features are added to this product. It is available with the name of SQL Server on Linux. It has a world class RDBMS, open source enterprise environment, and certain important features like dynamic data masking, row level security, data encryption and security are added. Now, what do I mean when I say dynamic data masking? It limits sensitive data exposure by masking to non-privileged users. It is used to greatly simplify the design and coding of security in the application. When I say row level security enables customers to control access to rows in a database based on user executing the query. So, here when we say that SQL Server for Linux is available, SQL Server Microsoft is coming with a open source database. So, of course, when company like Microsoft is launching the open source version, it is not going to include all the features which are available into the proprietary database, because users should also know that quality does come with a price, a very nice saying goes. So, I am not saying that your open source databases are lack in the quality or something like that. No, nowadays open source databases have so many features that their proprietary counterparts are having. But to initially start with, Microsoft has come with the database support of SQL of Linux. So, you can explore that into detail on the Microsoft's website. The next category, the next database which we come on to is MariaDB. MariaDB is a community developed fork of MySQL RDBMS. MariaDB maintains the compatibility with MySQL, ensuring drop-in replacement for MySQL databases. Now, here many people have might have heard so many versions about MariaDB. The taking over of MySQL by Oracle led to so many discussions among the IT community, among the network fraternity, that the developers had decided that it has to remain open source, the guarantee of being open source, and that is why they had come up with a version of MariaDB. So, MariaDB of course has all the features of MySQL, but it is coming with the newer features, newer additions into MariaDB. So, we will have a quick look at the features of MariaDB, because otherwise when we will see into detail MySQL, you automatically learn how MariaDB functions. So, some of the features of MariaDB are: it is scalable, it is robust, it has the rich plugins, the efficient storage engine. But here storage engine, when I am talking about, we all know that MySQL uses InnoDB, but a new storage engine named Aria is included in MariaDB, which is intended to be both transactional and non-transactional engine, and talks are also there that it might be included in the future versions of MySQL. Here the latest versions include the GIS and JSON features. ExtraDB replaces InnoDB and the new storage engine Aria. And one of the European banks has also funded MariaDB with $25 million into 2017. So, now we come to one of the most powerful proprietary or open source database, which is the topmost in the open source database category, is MySQL. Now, here when we are talking about MySQL, here we discuss how MySQL under different categories or different versioning MySQL is available, from where can you download MySQL, and we will look at workbench of MySQL. But in today's session, we are concluding MySQL, and in the next session we start with MySQL and then the other NoSQL databases. So, this session we saw what are the open source databases into the SQL category, and in the next session we come with MySQL of SQL category and then all the other of NoSQL category. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.